Hey listeners, if you like this podcast, check out our other show, The Study Table. Listen to archived content and in-depth interviews with insiders and innovative people working with student athletes. It's on our website, www.fredopie.com. Welcome to the Dinner Table, a discussion with food as a lens into cultures and societies. I'm Fred Opie. What you're about to hear are excerpts from a lecture food historian Fred Opie delivered as part of the 27th annual Zora Neale Hurston Festival in Eastonville, Florida. He delivers a lecture entitled A Dinner Inspired by Zora, a buffet-style feast based on the book Zora Neale Hurston Florida Food, in which Opie uses the menu for the event to talk about Florida's historic foodways. Enjoy the show.
Now, Their Eyes Were Watching God it was on the bookshelf of my mother's bookshelf at home. And I know there's a number of young people here, and I can tell you that when I was your age, ones that are here, I was not reading Their Eyes Were Watching God. I was not paying attention. But as I got older and began to realize how important she was, I began to pay a lot more attention. Those that are here, the young folks, I really admire you. You're light years ahead of where I was when I was your age. And I think you are to be commended for doing what was necessary to be invited to come to this event. Can we give a round of applause for that? I was teaching in New York State, and I believe it was around 2004, 2005. In the state, we have this thing called the Big Read. And that means that the state decides that there's one book that all the children in public school are going to read. I don't know if it's high school seniors or juniors, I'm not sure. But one year, 2004, 2005, it was Their Eyes Were Watching God. So again, I delve into it another time. And I had just published my first book called Hog and Hominy. And it looked at the history of food in the African American experience. So once I wrote that book, I began to see food in a lot of different spaces that most people don't see. For example, we got this presidential election going on right now, what I call the race to the White House. So I have a blog, and it's called foodasAlens.com. And if you go on there, there's a series I started called Stumping and Eating, the role of food in politics. So as you think about the election, I think about what people are eating when they're out. There was a new thing that my wife and I were talking about with Hillary Clinton eating hot peppers. I don't know if you all heard about that. That when she gets sick or feels a symptom coming on, she eats a hot pepper and it just knocks out what other symptoms she has. So I look at all those kind of things when people are out. So when it came to literature and Their Eyes Were Watching God, it really seemed to me to be a great look at what was going on in the 1920s, 1930s, the time period that the book is set in. And it just became a gateway where I said to myself, what else has Zora Neale Hurston said about food as an anthropologist? So I spent 1 year at Harvard University, spending an entire year dedicated to going through all the material that she had produced, all the material that she wrote, and that's how I came up with the book. I'm going to talk off of the menu. Okay, and this is food that directly relates to Zora Neale Hurston and her life. So let's start off first with cornbread. Why is cornbread significant to Zora Neale Hurston? I'll tell you why. She was born in the wintertime, during this time of the year, and she was born during a season known as hog killing time. So she was born in the winter during hog killing time, and also during the time when sweet potatoes were harvested. That's the time of year she was born. During hog killing time, whole communities would come together, but not just one community. It was one of the very few times during Jim Crow segregation where white and black communities actually would come together to harvest hogs. Sometimes 12, sometimes 6 hogs. It's a lot of work. And what would happen is the men would do the heavy lifting. The women would take the different parts of the hogs that were harvested and they would cook. They would make lard from it. They would make cornbread, and then they would take the skin, deep fry the skin, and it would be part of the cornbread mix. So it was a very important part of her own experience. Tell you another something significant about cornbread with Zora Neale Hurston. It was a sow, a pig, who taught her how to walk. What am I talking about? She was a very small toddler, could not walk yet. Her mom gave her a piece of cornbread. She was consuming the cornbread, eating it. The door was open, and the sow smelt it. The sow was pregnant. Smelt the cornbread, trying to take in as many calories as possible so she can feed her babies. And she came in and found Zora consuming the cornbread and began to go right towards Zora. Her mom was out doing something, so she wasn't around. Zora quickly learned how to walk. This is by her own account. I'm not making this up. So the stories I'm going to share with you about Zora and food come directly from her own words. Look at something else on here. Collard greens. I would say that greens, collard greens, kale, turnip greens, all these were the staples of the Hurston family. They grew just about everything that they consumed. We have this big farm-to-table movement now, eating local. Folks were doing that stuff even before we started using that terms. So you have a lot of stories of her with her mom going to the garden, picking the greens, washing the greens, and preparing the greens. What's interesting about the collard greens and all greens is it is a gendered process of making collard greens. I've never seen in any of the records that she discussed or other sources where men are involved in picking greens and the labor-intensive process of cleaning and cutting and preparing greens. It's a very gendered thing that's happened. Now, I suspect it goes all the way back to Africa, as my mother would say, the motherland, where Africans regularly ate what they call bush greens. They would go out into the wild and they knew what was edible. It was usually an adult, an elder, who would take a young child and take them out into the bush and show them what was edible. And typically that young child was a female child. So I think it became a very gendered process to actually eat greens that continued after we came here. Another thing that we see here on the menu is chicken. Now, chicken is very significant for many things, but what we don't necessarily know is the role it played in Zora's life. There were two things that she would say she didn't like because she ate them so often. One was chicken, the other one was fish. As you all may know or may not know, she was a PK, a preacher's kid. And when you were a PK, one of the things in your community was to have the privilege of hosting the pastor and his family. And so you and your family as a PK kid, you would regularly go to people's house, and Sunday was the day that you beat biscuits and you made fried chicken. Why Sunday? Because if you go back to the antebellum period time, it was the only day off for enslaved people. It was the only time you had to actually do the labor-intensive process of killing a chicken, preparing a chicken, cleaning a chicken, deep frying a chicken. So Sunday became fried chicken day. And as you were invited to somebody's house and they were hosting the family of the pastor's family, she kept eating chicken after fried chicken after fried chicken. She talked about the point where she just didn't like eating it anymore. And the same thing, growing up around the body of water that's in this area, she ate a lot of fried fish. So we also have catfish on the menu. Two things that you see. Now, as she later became an anthropologist, she was out doing field work, she would go to a number of places to record a lot of the information that became part of her work, like Their Eyes Are Watching God. So she went to turpentine camps, she went to sawmill camps, and she went to agricultural camps where people were picking all kinds of things like grapefruit. And so she would see that when they would have their one day off, which was also on a Sunday, kind of interesting that continued from the antebellum period to contemporary period, that they would also have fried chicken. They would also have catfish. And so catfish became synonymous with the experience of being Southern. It's one of the most popular fish eaten in the South. Now, you all mentioned tilapia, okay, on the menu. Something that I heard. Tilapia is a fish that's indigenous to Africa, to the coast of Africa. Many people don't know that because there are tilapia farms that are all around the world. But tilapia is one of those fishes that are actually indigenous to the waters around the coast of West Africa. Also on here we have the sweet potato. I mentioned a little bit. Now, why is the sweet potato important? There's a number of reasons that I mentioned to you that she was born during hog killing season, during the season when people actually harvest sweet potatoes. But why has sweet potatoes always been such an important part of Southern foodways. Why has it always been such an important part of Zora's own experience? Because as many of you know, that there are two belts that there's three belts that people typically hear about. We have all probably heard of the Black Belt. That's the region of the South where large numbers of enslaved people were brought here to work during slavery. But there's two other significant belts that you should know about. And that is the Rice Belt. It's off the coast of Africa, the Senegambia region. And there's the Yam Belt. The Yam Belt were those forest regions of Africa where people, their most important staple was yams. Yeah. Many of us have probably read the book, what's it called? All Things Fall Apart. And you know the significance of that. I have students in my classes from Ghana, and they have the Yam Festival every year at Accra. If you're from Haiti, which I know one of the people I talk to is from Haiti, many parts of Haiti, they still have the yam celebration. So yams and sweet potatoes, their connection is that they go all the way back to Africa, and they became the replacement staple. There were Portuguese that actually introduced sweet potatoes to Africans way before they came here. Now, yams, you may not know this, yams is an African plant. Sweet potatoes is an American plant. It originates in the Americas. But the Portuguese, long before the slave trade, actually brought sweet potatoes and it became a part of the staples that Africans ate. So they were consuming that before they came here. When they came here, it was an important staple on slave ships to keep slaves alive. You invested money in these people, you wanted to make sure that that investment continued. So you made sure you gave people something close to what they were used to, like yams, like sweet potatoes. Then once people got here, it became a very important ration that masters gave to enslaved people. So there's a continuation of yams and sweet potatoes that goes a long ways back. But the key question I need to ask is, what's the difference between a yam and sweet potato? A yam tends to have a white flesh. It tends to be browner in complexion than the outside. The sweet potato tends to have an orange or reddish flesh. The outside of it tends to be more of a copper color. Those are the big things. A yam is probably the difference between a yam and sweet potato. If you're of Caribbean background or from Latin America, the difference between a yam and a sweet potato as far as taste would be the difference between a regular banana and a plantain. That's probably the best way to explain it to you. Okay? A yam is more like a potato. It's that more of a taste. But you can see in her life, she talked a lot about sweet potatoes and she saw it a lot in the field. There were stories that she collected as folklore when she was out in the field, and one of them was a place known as Diddy-Wah Diddy. It's one of the things she would talk about, Diddy-Wah Diddy. And Diddy-Wah Diddy is one of these places where it was almost like nirvana. It was heavenly for people. And people described it as a place where there was no lack of food. She collected the story among these turpentine workers, among these sawmill workers, where food was constantly a problem, having enough to eat. So this D.Y. Diddy was this place where you could always attain enough to eat. For example, there's stories of D.Y. Diddy where there were sweet potato pies that would go around the city or around the village of D.Y. Diddy with a fork in its back, just waiting for you to eat a slice of sweet potato pie. There were stories of barbecue and chicken that it would pull up to you so you could eat. But sweet potatoes is one of these things that you would hear about. There were stories that she collected of the giant sweet potato, where the sweet potato was so big that you had to go to a sawmill to cut it. These are the kind of things that she collected from these turpentine tents, which I found very interesting, and it tells you about the importance of sweet potatoes as a staple here in the state of Florida. Another one I'm looking down here, and it is, what's a rice dish on here? Black-eyed peas. Okay, black-eyed peas is indigenous to Africa. In Africa, they call them the cowpea. It was indigenous to Africa, a very important staple. And if you think about this, anywhere that you had slaves that disembarked in the Americas, anywhere, Brazil, feijoada, Portugal, and Puerto Rico, you have, rice and beans. Anywhere you had black folks who disembarked and worked in the experience of slavery, you will find a rice and beans dish. So you have hop and john, feijoada. There's all of these different dishes. If you're in different parts of the Caribbean, it's either rice and beans or peas and rice, but it's all the same thing. All right. There are two species of rice that most people don't realize. There's an African species originally, and there's an Asian species. African and Asian. So many of us who came here from a culture and society where that was another staple. Just like the yam, there's the rice. As you all probably know, rice production in South Carolina, low country South Carolina, low country Georgia. That was black African-American intellectual property. Europeans didn't know how to grow that. It was Africans that made that a cash crop, to the point where it became known as Carolina gold because it was so profitable. So here in the state of Florida, I was asking Travis the other day, who drove me from the airport. I said, what is the local cuisine here? What's the thing that's Florida? Like if I'm in Philly, it's what? Cheesesteak, right? If you're in Buffalo, upstate New York, it's what? Chicken wings, right? There's just all these different things. If you're in parts of South Carolina, North Carolina, well, North Carolina probably more than anything else, I think of barbecue. But I asked him, what is the thing what is distinguishing about Florida food? Because you get off the plane and you're driving and there's strip malls on one side, strip malls on the other side. I can do the same thing in Pennsylvania and look like the same strip malls. But what's distinctive? Well, from what I can understand from studying Zora Neale Hurston is chicken pilau. That would probably be the thing. You might say a little bit different. I have a New York accent, but chicken pilau. Well, how do you all say it? Pilau? All right. Now, that particular dish goes back to, again, understanding that Africans who came here came from these rice-producing cultures. The term pilau actually comes from Persia. That's where the term pilaf comes from. It comes from a Persian word. But that is something very distinctive about Florida food that you might want to think about marketing as your thing. It may be the thing you want to make a part of the Zora Neale Hurston Festival because she's constantly talking about it. Now, there's this thing that she finds when she's out in the field that I had never seen before, and it's called a toe party, T-O-E party. Toe parties were these parties at these, sawmill camps, turpentine camps, where the women would take off their shoes, take off their socks. It's going to be G-rated, folks. Don't worry. It's going to be G-rated, all right? So they took off their shoes and their socks, and they would go up on a stage, and they would have like a curtain that would cover them. And the only thing they would stick out was the bare toe. And then the men would come up, and they would choose the person they wanted by the toe they found most attractive. All right? This is a story she collected. Now, when you collected the toe you wanted, you took that person and it was your responsibility to treat them to food. And one of the foods on the menu would have been chicken pilau. That's where that story comes from, Zora Neale Hurston.
We'll be right back. For more interviews and related content, you can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, and other podcast distributors. Also, check out our website at www.fredopie.com. Ask questions on Facebook at Frederick Douglass Opie and on Twitter at Dr. Fred D. Opie. For information about advertising on the show, please email us at fdopie@gmail.com. That's fdopie@gmail.com. For similar content, go to our show archives and listen to the podcast entitled Zora Neale Hurston and the WPA.
She is got an interest in spirituality that makes her attuned, makes her interested in learning things that are at a deeper level than probably most people in her field of anthropology would go into. For example, in Louisiana, she does all this different work with voodoo. She does it with all these other, she goes through all kinds of rituals to become, again, immersed or embedded in the community. All kinds of rituals to the point where you'd say, wow, isn't this a little bit too far? But that's how she is.
Now back to the show.
Now, in the book, as you're all gonna get a copy of it, just about everything I'm talking about, there's recipes in here. And they're recipes from the time period. They're not modern recipes. They're recipes from the 1920s, 1917, 1930, 1940, all about the stuff that we're talking about. The pineapple upside down cake. This is a really interesting story that Zora talks about. And it came from reading one of her letters, and a collection of her letters were available at if I remember correctly, at Yale University archives. And she gets in a fight with somebody, in an argument, disagreement, and she finally realizes she's wrong. Anybody that knows anything about Zora, you'll find out she was stubborn, which had its benefits and it had its problems, but she could be really stubborn. So she gets in a fight with the person, she realizes she's wrong, and as a way of making amends or making up, she bakes a cake. People always ask me, could Zora cook? She could cook. She could cook. So she bakes this cake and she sends it to people. So it was one of those things that I thought was really interesting, that a cake is a special occasion item, and it was a way for her to say to somebody else she's sorry. So that's what I think about when I see the cake. I also want to go back to the chicken that's on the menu. When she went to New York, she went to attend Barnard College, and she was struggling financially. And one of the things that she did, and you see this in one of her personal letters, where she came up with a business idea, the way she was going to make money. She was going to open a catering business. It would focus on nothing but chicken dishes. Chicken consommé, chicken pilau, fried chicken, all these different ways. So she knew enough about how to cook this, and she learned it from her mom. She knew enough about that she figured that she could go into business and make enough to support herself working through college. So kind of interesting if you think about, she and her mother were very close. Her mother died at a very young age. Most of what I can get from her is that she learned all these dishes from her mom. Even though they were middle class African Americans, it doesn't seem from anything I can see that they had anybody work in the house as a domestic servant. And her mom cooked just about everything. So that's about everything I can think of on the menu that's directly related to Zora Neale Hurston. There was so much that could be written, probably 3 or 4 different books, and probably 3 or 4 different talks I could give about Zora Neale Hurston and food. I think that's enough for at least that we can turn to a Q&A, and you can ask a question where I could give you something additional that you might want to know from what you heard thus far. Great question. She asked, can you tell us a little bit about corn pudding? Corn is an American plant, indigenous to the Americas. The Portuguese around the 15th century introduced corn to Africa. So by the time the African slave trade started, Africans were already planting corn in their gardens. They didn't learn it when they got here and got off a slave ship. Okay? So it's been around. It's a very important staple. And in their gardens, many free people, and you'll see this in Zora Neale Hurston's descriptions of Eastonville in their Eyes Were Watching God, people regularly grew their own corn for their own consumption, self-consumption. The other thing that's important is that it's a sweet dish. There are 2 states where you see sugar being an important cash crop in the U.S. colonies or the British colonies. That's Louisiana and Florida. They're the only 2 places where sugar is a cash crop. So you see sugarcane plentiful described during the antebellum period before the end of slavery, and you also see it come up in a number of descriptions in her own work. We also, which is kind of interesting, that today kids may chew on gum, but back then you chewed on a piece of sugar cane. So you take these 2 sugar cultures and corn as an important staple and subsistence crop, and you put together and you have the corn pudding. Puddings were one of those things that come strictly from our English roots. Okay, puddings, Africans didn't do puddings. It was strictly British. We talked about the sweet potato pie. The concept of a pie did not exist in Africa. Central Africa, West Africa, that is British culture. But we have these 2 different cultures come together. This West and Central African culture where yams were in existence, and you have this British culture where the British made a lot of pies, but most of them were savory pies, meat pies. So you take these 2 different cultures, you put them in the same spot, and then you put the African in charge of the kitchen, and you end up with a sweet potato pie. Another question. Yes?
Which dish do you think has stayed the same, and which do you think has changed the most because of the way we prepare food and package food and share food?
I think first the fried chicken. I think the puddings, whether it be sweet potato pone, which is another name for pone is pudding. I think those are similar. I think the rice pilaf. By the way, in South Carolina, they call it a chicken bog. You all call it chicken pilaf. In South Carolina, they call it a chicken bog, which is a very important part of raising money and getting people out to vote. As a candidate, you put on a chicken bog and everybody comes. So I think those dishes will probably be the ones that are the most similar. Yes, ma'am?
What about the role of spices?
People often ask me, what's the difference between soul food and southern food? Soul food tends to have more spice to it. Tends to be spicier and hotter. Anybody who is from a hot climate, whether it's Latin America, Asia, or Africa, the Caribbean, they all eat very spicy food. You gotta ask yourself, why? because spicy food leads to a gastrointestinal sweating that cools the outside of your body. That's why people who eat hot food tend to come from hot climates. So Africans, they understood that. So long before we came to the Americas, we were consuming a lot of this very, very spicy food. Now, salt, which leads to a lot of hypertension, a lot of problems. One of the things to keep in mind that in Africa, people would sell a slave for salt. It was that valuable. Interesting tradition in Africa with salt is when you gave a marriage gift and you were giving it to the bride's family, once the bride came home and lived with your son in your compound, if it was known that this was a bride who was a virgin, then you gave a block of salt to that family. If it became known or suspected that she wasn't a virgin, you drilled a hole in the block of salt and then you gave it to the family. So salt and pepper, very common. During the antebellum period, very few people had access to a lot of spices. If you had a lot of spices, it would be like wearing a lot of bling. It was that valuable. So there were not a lot of spices. Most common things were things like the use of garlic, onion, other herbs you could grow in your garden, and then salt and pepper. Great question. Yes, ma'am.
What was your favorite food?
And what was Zora's favorite food? Great question. My impression would have been the collard greens. This is something that you may or may not know about Zora's. It's evident that she had some stomach problems. And she did whatever she could with the income she had to take care of them, including taking herbs. There's a whole chapter in this book called Food Pharmacy, where I look at all of her recordings that she got from these work camps on natural remedies, because these were people who were too poor to afford doctors, and doctors weren't servicing them. So there's a whole chapter on food pharmacy. So she had a keen interest in that for herself. Beans, I see her consume a lot of rice and beans, like Hoppin' John, like that dish. But I also got the feeling that greens, that she really liked collard greens. That's a great question. Yes?
I always thought that pork was a major part of the diet back then, yet there's no pork on the menu.
He said, I always thought that pork was an important part of the diet. Absolutely, it was back then. Why was pork such an important part of the African-American culinary canon? Pork came to the Americas before black folks did. Columbus on his second voyage had something like 300 hogs. As the explorers were going from one part to the Americas, they would take, because there weren't no refrigerators, folks. So the way that you got your food is the food stayed alive. The ideal of taking food and cutting it up into small packages and then selling it, that just didn't happen. And if you look, think about this. From the Caribbean, from Africa, I got a friend from Nigeria. To this day, he never buys chicken unless it's alive. For people from other countries, when they buy animals that have been slaughtered, they want the eyes still in the animal because they can tell the health of the animal by looking at the eyes. So most of these people don't do that. Hogs quickly spread. There was no predators here to stop them from spreading. Once the Africans came here, it was one of the ways that Africans could subsidize their diet. They could raise hogs, which, as you know, will eat just about anything, and they flourish quickly. Most litters of a hog are 10 or more pigs. So it became a quick way to obtain protein in an ineffective way, and people would often raise pigs to feed themselves, but also to sell them and to buy their freedom, their manumission for them or children. So it was an important part of Southern cuisine for both whites, blacks, and everybody else. So it's a good question. He said, if you did the study of another writer, would you find as much food content as you did in Zora? Absolutely yes. I taught a course this past winter called Food in the African American Canon. We used the Eyes Were Watching guide, but we also used the Autobiography of the Next Colored Man. Food is throughout the book. So there are a number of writers that, for some reason, that's just in there. And I find it fascinating. William Faulkner, same thing. There's food throughout his work. And he's a contemporary of Zora. And maybe people who lived during the period of the Great Depression. I know there was this aspects of my father's childhood that just never left. The idea of just throwing something out or not using every aspect of it It never left him, no matter what his economic status was. But that's a great question. In my studies of Zora, which foods were most influential of black people? I think it's pork. Because either you're consuming pork or using it to season your greens. And I think it's probably the most damaging one on our health. You know, there were certain dishes, certain pork parts that were like courting food. Like, you know, if you think of Valentine's Day, you know, a lot of us buy candy. Back then, a lot of people buy pickled pig's feet. That was like what you give to the girl you like. Chitlins. Chitlins was considered a delicacy. New Year's Eve. Every New Year, somebody's eating chitlins. So I think it's pork. That's a great question. Because barbecue. Definition of barbecue in the state of Florida, pork. Now in Texas, it'd be beef. So I think it would be pork. Now, did you have a question? He said, besides the salt, are there other foods that are... That's a great question. Let me go back a little bit more to the chicken. In African culture, West and Central Africa, think about this in the Caribbean, well, particularly in Haiti. Poultry, and particularly poultry that had white feathers, was very symbolic. It was very spiritual. It helped when you became a titled person in your community. And to become a titled person, you had to buy gifts to give to the other titled people. You had to have enough to be able to have a big reception after you went through the ceremony to become a titled person. And very often, what was given away and what was eaten at that was poultry. You think about a lot of voodoo practices. A lot of those ceremonies involve poultry. And another interesting thing I found in Zora Neale Hurston's work, because remember, she had a Guggenheim fellowship and she spent almost a year or more in the Caribbean studying, again, as a PK kid. I think as a child who was in tune with spirituality, she was very interested in spirituality. So while she's in Haiti, she's studying a lot of these things. And something that came up I thought was really interesting. She talks about celebrations like picnics, when people go out for a Sunday picnic. I mentioned, you know, what's the part of the what would you give to somebody who you were interested in romantically? On a picnic when you had chicken, if you want to show somebody you really were interested in, you gave them the chicken wing. And the chicken wing was symbolic of, I think for the African, the most important part of the bird. Now, going back to the salt, if you were an enslaved person, and this came out of her work in the Caribbean, if you were an enslaved person and you wanted to keep yourself pure, you would not eat salted pork, which is one of the most important rations, or salted cod, that's another one. And it was believed if you ate that food, it would make you impure. And at the time of death, you would lose the ability to fly back to the Africa as a soul. So I think the chicken wing, the idea of the salt and this purity all comes in her work. And you see this in a number of African celebrations, the centrality of chicken and particularly the chicken wing. You were never, when you were to hunt, this, again, all this stuff is coming back to me now from study. When you hunted a bird and killed a bird, you were never to break the wing. There was something precious about the wing. And there was something understood about flying away, the ability to return your body back to Africa, even during slavery. So these are symbolic and important things. Thank you.
Check out our podcast archive, suggest show topics, and advertise on the show. And to book me as a guest and or speaker, visit our website, www.fredopie.com. That's www.fredopie.com. Thanks for listening, and be good.